Hi everyone, my name is Anastasia Ostrowski, and I'm going to be talking today about our paper on mixed method long-term robot usage, specifically focusing on older adults' lived experience of social robots. In HR, we are very fascinated in understanding how are people going to engage with these systems in long-term contexts. But how long is long-term? In previous literature, this has been cited as 2 months, 5 weeks, so you can tell there's a variety of different time periods that this is defined as. So perhaps let's consider novelty instead. But then when does the novelty effect end? Previous literature has cited this period lasting 2 months, 4 weeks, and so again, you can tell there's a variety of answers. We are still very interested in understanding how these systems can be studied in long-term contexts as well. One of the most common methods that people use are qualitative methods, and this involves interviewing, diary logs to capture people's experiences. These experiences and this qualitative data can also be paired with quantitative data, and this quantitative data can come from robot usage logs as well. In the field, there's a lot of interest in further promoting mixed method approaches that combine both qualitative and quantitative data, such as the way that we've done it in our work, studying a robot in a long-term context where older adults hosted it in their homes. Our process is embedded in a 1-year-long co-design, and we worked with 28 older adults ages 70 to 94 years of age. The process that I've shown here is the overall co-design process that you can learn more about in the Roman 2021 paper on this project. However, I'm going to focus on the robot hosting and robot debrief stages. The robot hosting stage is where older adults were living with a robot in their home for at least a month, though several of our participants decided to keep the robot for longer than 1 month. And then we have our robot debrief stage, where older adults recapped their experience with us about a month into the hosting process. The data that is gathered in this stage is our robot usage logs and interviews. Our interviews are our qualitative data, and the robot usage logs are our quantitative data that makes up our holistic mixed method approach. So now I'm going to talk about our quantitative results. Our quantitative results are divided into 3 different groups, and these groups are defined by the length of time that people were hosting the robot. We have our overall group, which includes all of our participants with their robot usage logs. We have our under 50 participant group, which is where the participants hosted the robot for less than 50 days. And then we have our over 50 group, which is participants who hosted the robot for greater than 50 days in their homes. When I talk about the results, I'm going to have the number of actions on the y-axis, and I'm going to put the weeks on the bottom. We're looking at a 2-month period here, as we thought it was very informative to look at the very beginning of the hosting period. And you're going to see, as the legend shows, the 3 different groups shown on the next graph. So these are the usage patterns across the 2 months, and you can see that it looks like the patterns stabilize into a consistent usage around maybe weeks 2 or 3. When we did statistical testing, we found that the only 2 weeks that were statistically different from one another for all of the groups was week 1 and week 2, suggesting that the user's usage pattern had stabilized somewhere in that time period. We also compared the exponential decay rates to kind of look deeper into usage in the paper, as well as we look a little deeper into what interactions are the people actually doing with the robot. Now I'm going to focus on our qualitative results. We also have 3 groups for this particular type of data. However, they are defined differently than the quantitative results. We look at the overall characteristics of the usage pattern to define these groups. We have our typical usage group, which is characterized by a high initial exploration and then dropping to a more consistent exploration. Our low usage group, which is characterized by periods of non-usage. And then our high usage group, where they had overall very high usage and a less significant usage drop overall. So first we're going to look at our typical group. And before I show those graphs, I'm going to walk you through how we'll talk about them. So our average usage will be on the y-axis and the days is on the x-axis. And again, we're looking at a 2-month period. So this is our first graph. It's P11 and P12. And our next example is P29, where you can see the overall usage trends. Now we're going to go into the qualitative data to understand what themes are coming up for this group. One of the main things was frustration. For example, they said, the dialogue is just a 1-2 kind of thing. That was one thing that became sort of evident, that it would be much more engaging if you could have a back and forth that had more than just 2 elements. So conversation was a key focus here. And this also played into why the robot wasn't matching their expectations as much, and was tied to memory, where users really wanted the robot to remember what they just said or a previous conversation. Lastly, they also talked about feelings of guilt, where the design of the robot made them feel compelled that they should interact with it, or they felt guilty that they weren't engaging with it. Next, we're going to move on to our low usage group. In our low usage group, here's an example of P08, P09, and P13. We're going to spend some time going into P13 a little bit to kind of talk about these periods of non-usage. These were defined by proactivity and transparency as two themes. They said it went from sort of cute to creepy to I couldn't keep it on for the whole day. I would take blocks. I didn't like the thing moving, following me in my house. And so they decided to not use the robot because they couldn't keep it on because of its proactive nature. For P13, we also talked to them about using the right wording. And so what they meant by this was that it was hard at times for them to figure out what was the correct way for them to talk to the robot, making them not use the system as much. For P09, they also had periods of non-usage, just to refresh your memory. This was also anchored in proactivity and transparency. They said, is he recording audio? Is he recording video? Who's listening to it? You, the researcher, told us you wouldn't be, but thanks to Facebook, we don't trust you. And therefore, this aspect of trust really defined their usage or non-usage in this case. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the high usage. So here's P02, our first example. They use the robot as a social catalyst, meaning that they like to have people come over and interact with them and the robot. So they were really using it as a way to keep their human-human relationships very strong. They also mentioned this aspect of feeling of guilt, like P11 and P12. They said, I must confess, I got tired of it toward the end. After I had him here, I wasn't checking every day, and then I felt guilty. So in the morning, the first thing I do is say, good morning, Jibo. Our next participant is P10, and they had the highest usage out of anyone in the participant group. The other graphs I've shown you are around 120. This is 450 for the average usage of this robot, just to put it in perspective. And so for P10, they also asked Jibo 1,000 questions to really define their exploration. And they were exploring the robot and grading it on how it did in the various answers to the questions. And this is a very unique usage pattern, as we did not request any of the older adults to investigate the robot in this manner. So these are our different usage groups and the different trends. And what made it really powerful is combining our quantitative and qualitative data together. But you may be asking, what have we learned about how to conduct long-term robot studies using mixed method approaches? So our first guideline that we present in our work is to incorporate both quantitative and qualitative data to create a fuller picture of the robot experience, as we've done here. We also really emphasize that you can learn about users' perspective of the technology before and after living with the technology long term to further inform what this experience really means to people. And though we don't talk about it in this paper, we do have before interview data as well as this after data that is discussed here. For our third guideline, we say that the robot should be easy to set up, reliable, autonomous, and tested in the real world before being deployed into context, help minimize any issues or frustration on the part of the user. And for guideline 4, the research team should be easily reachable. So if there is any frustration, the participants in the study have a clear direction of how they can reach out to someone. For guideline 5, the researcher should explain how the system works and what data is being collected to increase transparency. And for our 6th guideline that builds on this, the researchers must be mindful of the ethical dimensions surrounding the work. For example, the researchers should be mindful to address concerns around privacy, data collection, transparency of interactions, and other areas. They should also be mindful of people's attachment to these systems and be careful to design really mindful entry and exit strategies for the technology, being mindful of how people may create connections to these devices. And I want to leave you with this last thought about how qualitative and quantitative usage and non-usage is critical to understand how humans interact with robots and how we can better design robots and the studies around them so we can really understand these systems in long-term social contexts. And with that, I would like to acknowledge our co-designers, who we couldn't have done this without them throughout the whole process we've engaged with them, as well as Daniela G. Paula and John Ferguson for help with acquiring the usage logs and initial processing of the data. This work is funded by Samsung Research and in part by the Human Care Robot Technology for Aging Society program of the South Korean government. And with that, I would like to say thank you, and we look forward to answering any of your questions that you may have at HRI 2022.